Good morning, everyone. It's Mrs. Wallace. Just a shout out about the quiz that's on Tuesday. It will generally be a multiple choice quiz that has some information that comes from the McKay source, some information that is about the general distinction between scholasticism and humanism. So if you have questions about that, definitely check out some of the videos that are there for you to study. This video is really focusing on some of the challenges to Burkhart's thesis, as well as maybe some of the challenges even to some of the narrative that's presented in the McKay text in terms of the significance of the Renaissance. So this really fits more on the side of the debate that Thorndike was suggesting, that maybe there, and Peter Burke is suggesting, maybe there is some degree of myth. And this fits around the question of, how, widely spread were some of the feelings of the Renaissance if we attach the Renaissance to an increase in innovation and individualism. Maybe to some degree that happens, and maybe to some degree that filters into the larger society at a later point. There's certainly a lot of groups of people who are excluded from this kind of idea of the Renaissance as a form of progress. So that's kind of what Burkhart pitches, and that's what Thorndike questions. And in our current moment, and remember, historiography and the study of history and the narratives about history are often as much about the current moment, the time that the historian is writing in. So historians who are writing history today are speaking to the current climate we're in. And as a society, we're having discussions about diversity, equity, and inclusion, for example. We're having discussions about the rights for school students who identify as transgender. We have discussions about what history should be promoted in the Smithsonian museums. We're having all of these political debates through some of the current executive orders, and that political climate is also influencing the way people see and understand and write about history. So historians in our current moment are likely writing as much for this current moment than they are writing for the past, right? So in a sense, we all bring something to the table when you're studying history. You have some of your own kind of thoughts and ideas about perhaps the current political moment, about perhaps things that you've encountered in your own personal lived experiences. So all of those things are part of the lens that you look at when you consider history, and where you weigh some of the significance, of the historical narrative. So just kind of keep that in mind, because if you're looking at Burkhart and Thorndike or Peter Burke or any other historian who's authoring kind of a story about the Renaissance, history on one hand is like, well, what happened during the Renaissance? And we can kind of include a whole set of facts about that. But the way we tell the narrative about what happened during the Renaissance is really what historians do. And that tends to vary based on, when and in what way historians approach the topic. So some of this presentation is really focused on looking at alternative perspectives during the time of the Renaissance, and to some degree weighing the significance of those perspectives. So some of what you're doing in that post, where you're kind of asking yourself the question, how much can a time period be called like a golden age or a renaissance if not everybody in the society is experiencing it, very much speaks to, how do we determine progress in a society? What are even the ways that we measure that? How do we look at places in the past or times in the past that we might highlight and say, this was a time of, whatever, greatness or progress, or in some ways, some sort of, advancement of humankind. How do we measure that, and what are the parameters for that measurement? And in order to do that, we do need to include a great deal of perspectives. And so earlier in class, and I'm not going to go back to the earlier slides, but they're there so you can use them in terms of the quiz. We did look at the Renaissance happenings of the Iberian Peninsula, which very much sees the Reconquista, which is the reconquering of Al-Andalus, which was an Islamic part of the Islamic Empire, kind of an independent section of the Umayyad and then Abbasid Empire. And we see varying degrees of religious tolerance under the Islamic Empire, but primarily there's a great deal of religious tolerance, and that changes in the 1400s and even a little bit before, depending on where you are in the Iberian Peninsula, where there's a reconquest by Spanish leaders, Isabella and Ferdinand, leaders of Castile and Aragon, so particular kind of areas that start to dominate and reconquer the Iberian Peninsula and essentially create a Roman Catholic state. Okay, so on Monday we'll look at Isabella and Ferdinand as kind of like a power couple that pretty much move the society of modern day Spain and Portugal into a Roman Catholic state that will really not be part of a Protestant Reformation that's going to occur elsewhere in Europe. We're going to see Spain kind of be maintained as a Roman Catholic state, and Roman Catholicism becomes mandated in that society. And as a result, we see a lot of effects on Jews and Muslims in the Iberian Peninsula, both groups who had been very high in number during the time of the Islamic Empire, ultimately start to either migrate and flee, and we get large numbers of pockets of people who are establishing themselves in different parts of Northern Africa, maybe the Ottoman Empire, maybe some European cities. So Sephardic Jews and Muslims primarily in the group of Moriscos, people who had blended quite well into the culture of the Iberian Peninsula, all of a sudden for religious discrimination are going to be under assault, and will largely be in today's modern times we would look at this as ethnic cleansing. Okay, so kind of have some of that in your background. We talked about that a little bit in class. Another two groups or three groups that I think it's useful just to make a couple of comments about, and in the post that you have for Monday, you're asked to kind of dig into one of these groups in a little bit more detail. So this is kind of an overview, but one group primarily is to consider Africans during the time of the Renaissance. And this is a really significant topic, one that we dig into a little bit more when we start to look at, the colonialism that happens in the New World, for example. But we start to see a lot more interactions between European societies and African societies. These interactions will range. So you could take a city like Lisbon in the 1400s. It's a city in Portugal. By about 1400, 1500 into 1600, about 10% of the population of Lisbon is Black, largely African. And in some cases, this relates to the topic of slavery. We do see slavery in all of the societies we've studied so far. We see slavery in the Iberian Peninsula. Both Portugal and Spain will bring enslaved persons to the Iberian Peninsula. At this time, slavery is not race-based exclusively. So while there may be Africans who are enslaved, there are also many Europeans, for example, who are enslaved. There's a slave trade that is bringing enslaved persons to the Islamic Empire, the Ottoman Empire, for example. There's also a slave trade that's bringing individuals to the Iberian Peninsula. So slavery is not necessarily race-based. It's also not something that's that's necessarily permanent. So in the Americas, we hear about slavery where people are born into slavery and have that identity for the entirety of their lives. And that becomes a legal framework in the Americas. And the American definition of slavery will also become where enslaved persons are seen as property that can be bought and sold. In the case of slavery in Europe during the 14, 15, 1600s, we also see people enable themselves out of slavery. So slavery could be a temporary status. Some people may even sell themselves into slavery and after several years buy their way out. Some people, are free, in other words. So there's the percentage of that population in Portugal, for example, that might be African. A good number of people are also formally enslaved and free. You also have people who were always free. So you have large numbers of Africans who are coming to Europe for a variety of reasons. Some people to study, just like people today kind of move all over the world to study. You have people for religious reasons. So in some cases, Christians from Africa will travel to Portugal or Spain to study in religion and Christianity. So we get all kinds of reasons that people are kind of creating this hub of diversity within, for example, the Iberian Peninsula. And this is also happening in other areas of Europe, especially Italy, for example. Egypt and Italy are very connected via trade at this time. So there's like a lot of diversity in Europe that we don't often hear about in the Renaissance. And a lot of this is representative of people in a variety of different economic statuses. So that's kind of important to note. We also have people who are what we would today describe as mixed race individuals within the Medici family, for example. There's a great deal of whether it's due to some type of consensual type of relationship or assault. We definitely see interactions that lead to diverse kind of backgrounds. We also have a lot of people of color in art. This is not exactly a known work of art in terms of historians knowing everything about this woman's background, but this piece of artwork, which is actually in a museum in Princeton, New Jersey, has become quite a talking point amongst historians. It's by an Italian artist in 1580, and the title is Portrait of an African Woman Holding a Clock. It is likely that to this young woman's right, there's another person, and the current work of art doesn't include that additional person, just the sleeve of the dress. It's likely that the woman we're staring at is, and the woman who's like staring at us, is likely a servant. Could be enslaved, but she's dressed very well. It's not exactly clear what her role is, but she is standing next to somebody whose sleeve is much more adorned, than hers is. But the focus for the artist is clearly on the young woman we're looking at, whose gaze is very kind of connected to the viewers. And, she seems to be almost like speaking out. She's holding a clock, which in the time period was like a new and exciting, people in the time period would be looking at the clock. That's like the big, kind of tech thing that's going on at the time. So she's selected, to be, in a sense, the focus of this work of art. And it tells us some things because it's not necessarily the traditional Renaissance art that we see, and who we see in art sometimes does give us an impression of what history was all about. So we need to kind of extend sometimes our canon of art because sometimes those choices were made many years ago. And, there's always kind of this question about who picks, the art, for example, that might be representative of a particular period. So if we're looking at the Renaissance, we're looking at all these works of art, we can question, things about the works of art, but we can also question, were there other works of art? Okay. And that's where this is kind of headed. The other things to note is that there's a great deal of discussion about the beginnings of racist ideas and the attachment of race and enslavement. We'll get into this some more when we start to look at slavery as a topic, but prior to the time period of the Renaissance, slavery is not race-based. So at some point in the 1400s, there does seem to become a bunch of ideas that historians describe as racist ideas, where there's an attachment of individuals who are largely African, but instead of being ethnically from variety of places, there's a movement of Europeans to use skin color to describe a large, kind of group of people. We see some of that documented in the time period of the 1400s.